Boardroom Bound, Episode 34. Dr. Pat Harned explaining how to operate in the boardroom with integrity.
Most leaders are not reinforcing core values. They're not talking overtly about their commitment to integrity nearly enough. And when employees don't hear it, they actually believe that it doesn't matter. It's not that they think, oh, it's just not important. They actually believe that senior leaders don't care or they're altogether unethical.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's show, we're speaking with Dr. Pat Harned. She is the CEO of the Ethics and Compliance Initiative. And I'm sure all of my listeners will recognize this is a time when we need more knowledge about ethics and compliance. While it may not sound like the most fun topic, it is an essential topic. If you are a board member, you've got to be concerned. Not only do you have a fiduciary responsibility, but you have a moral obligation to ensure that the organization you're running is doing the right things, doing well, not only by their employees and for their shareholders, but it's something that we all want to dig into. Pat will, in a half an hour, will very quickly go through all of the key things that you would need to think of, both for a company to implement and a board director, how you then manage and interact with that. So we really peel back a bit of this onion, make it actionable and real. Some of the first things that you would do as a board member. Pat talks about that from her own experience. When she became a first-time board member, how did she walk into the room? What was she thinking about? What were the questions that she were asking? So actionable insights that you can take away and implement at your next meeting. Let's hear what Pat has to say. Pat Harned, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, I'm delighted to have you today because for some reasons, not necessarily always good, people would say, this is such an important time to be talking with the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, right? There's unfortunately so much going wrong in the world. I feel like you can't turn on the nightly news without saying, oh, there's another problem at a company. Sometimes the board is explicitly named. Other times people like us behind the scenes go, geez, were these guys asleep at the wheel? What happened? So this is relevant today. So whether you are an aspiring board director thinking, I want to be in the boardroom, need to understand the responsibilities, or whether you're already there today going, geez, how do I do this better? How do I manage this big, complex organization? Because I think a lot of it starts at the top. They set the tone. They're looking at the right strategy. So thrilled to have you here. But before I get ahead of myself and solve all of the world's problems from the boardroom, let's just start with a bit of your background. How did you get to this lofty position you're in today?
Well, again, thank you for having me. It's been an interesting journey. I think I am probably like most people in that the career I ended up with was not exactly the career I thought I would have. But I've been fortunate that it has sort of transpired the way that it has. So I first came to my organization 20 years ago. I had a background in education. All of my degrees are in education. Mm-hmm. And I was brought to the organization initially because they had an interest in doing outreach to schools. So my background was character development. I had got my PhD in the area, and I was starting to do outreach to secondary schools to try to prepare the next generation of workers for working in an ethical workplace. But I wasn't there very long before I ended up taking over the oversight of our research activities. And long story short, sort of rose up into different leadership roles. And I have now been CEO or the equivalent title for about 15 years. So it's been a fun journey. I actually don't do as much with education anymore, although our center does work with higher education institutions that are looking to create ethics and compliance programs. The majority of my focus now is really on corporate and sometimes nonprofit ethics.
Although I guess I would make the argument that you are doing a lot of education on a regular basis, no matter what your audience is, right? You're trying to get across so many good points for them to take home.
That's true. And I also think part of the reason the transition for me over the years has been as smooth as it has been is that a great deal of what you try to do in the classroom in developing character in students is what companies are trying to do with their ethics and compliance programs. At the end of the day, we're all on a journey of learning about ethics and compliance. We all relearn what the right thing is to do with every workplace we walk into. Mm-hmm. And so companies that are really trying to do good work in this area are trying to essentially help shape the character of their employees, make sure that they're not overstepping the law and that they're doing their work with the highest level of integrity. So there's a lot that has translated from my transition from primarily the education world to the corporate world.
And that makes sense. And let's just simplify this for a second, right? Because if we would try to enter this on a global level, it would get so much more complicated from regulation stuff. So let's just say U.S. for 1 second. But even taking that almost simplistic idea that you said, which is so complex to unpack it, is wildly different between nonprofit and for-profit. And then just take the for-profit world from the large mega-type corporations. I worked at J.P. Morgan before, 250,000 people. It's a battleship. Down to the smaller companies like a startup where they're more lean and nimble and don't have as many rule books written down. So all of that is probably just mind-bogglingly complex to do it in different types of organizations, right?
It is, and at the same time, it is not. So when you start to talk about compliance programs, the portion of the effort that is making sure that the organization has responded to and is responsible for all the regulatory and enforcement community suggestions for how they comply with the law, it does get very, very, very complex. And size of the organization, industry, all of those things very much influence what the program looks like. But when it comes to the actual idea that you're trying to make sure that your company is staying out of the fray and they are upholding a set of standards of business conduct, and how do you actually go about doing that, it actually looks the same in every organization, and the dynamics are the same. It's really about, and this is what a lot of my own background and training has taught me, but for the most part, most companies employ good people who want to come to work every day and work in a good company and uphold standards and do their jobs with excellence. So it's not so much that you have to teach people a whole new way of being. It's that you have to create an environment where good people can go to work every day and do good work, but also an environment where they will come forward and tell you that there are problems when they happen. And that approach is very similar, and the way the problems organizations face, the dynamics are almost universal.
And it's interesting when I reflect back on my Wall Street career, and we can see a lot of different scandals that happen from there, because money can be a very good motivator. But money is also one of the hardest things to structure in a way that motivates always the right behaviors. And some of the scandals that happened were just because no one had ever thought it could be done in such a way that, a few bad apples were able to figure out, there's a loophole here and I'll go exploit it. But just to make sure our audience can understand, do you feel like if you were starting a company from scratch, let's say someone came to you, let's say Bezos came into you and said, I'm going to start a new division, they're as if they were starting from a blank sheet of paper. Can you define for me what I need that organization to look like for the ethics and compliance? Is that the same approach you would take if you were dropped into an established company and said, this is a mess, we need to clean it up, what should we implement? Do you think it's a different model?
I think my answer would be fairly consistent between the two. Certainly a company that has had a program for a while often has to do a little bit of backtracking back to the basics. But for either organization, it really begins with having a set of core values or a set of standards that articulate how you want people to actually make decisions and guide their behavior. And it's not just a set of nice statements. It's generally ethical values. We want to we want to make sure we respect each other in the way we work, that we're responsible with our deadlines, that we're honest in our communications, those kinds of things. And then there is an effort to conduct training, and also there are some basic systems that have to be in place. A code of conduct that not only talks about those values and what they look like in everyday business, but also what are the typical compliance regulations when you've overstepped the bounds. What does it look like when you're doing right? What does it look like when you're not doing right? Having some systems in place for employees to come forward and raise concerns. Most companies think of an anonymous hotline.
Right.
That's actually not enough, but there need to be systems for people to know what happens when they come forward to their manager or to a helpline. And then periodic training to help people recognize when they need to speak up, when they are overstepping the bounds. It does get much more complex than that, but in spirit, it's some very basic principles of having values and systems in place. And then from there, the biggest thing that organizations need to do is to tend to their culture and also make sure that they're holding leaders accountable for their role in setting a tone from the top, making sure that the culture is healthy and that people are coming forward.
And when you say it like that, it doesn't sound like rocket science. It doesn't sound that hard. And I say that tongue in cheek, right? Because we're all busy people. There's a lot going on. This sounds like really good fundamental stuff to put in place. And I can look back on my time at JP Morgan and I can see the principles that Jamie Dimon wrote himself. And I believe there were 17 of them. And they were all given to us in a nice fancy book. And we're all told to follow them. But it was one of a million other things we're all doing. And we're bonused on certain things. So in my mind, what gets measured gets done. And what gets, incentivized financially is what gets done first. Ethics stuff wasn't incentivized in the sense of like, hey, if we don't have any bad reports, we're all going to get an extra bonus sort of thing. So maybe that's partly why we get down these paths where we have the best of ideas and we put them in place, but they don't last. What have you seen where you step back and you think, wow, companies are generally missing on these levers? I would tell all the CEOs listening to this, you should go away and talk about this thing tomorrow at your next meeting.
Well, I think you're right. I am absolutely speaking in broad general terms and sort of oversimplifying the situation in a big, large multinational companies. A single conversation about, let's say, export controls can get wildly complex and mind-numbing. But at the end of the day, what really drives employees' behavior comes from two things. The tone coming from the top, and whatever message gets reinforced by their own immediate supervisor. And all of the complex studies that have been out there, some of which my center has done on culture and employee reporting and in getting people to uphold the standards of the organization, even incentive programs, we all talk about it's all about culture. Well, culture really is, what do I believe the senior leadership thinks is most important? And what do I believe my own supervisor is going to reward me for? And that is what drives so much of employee behavior. And I do think, especially for CEOs, C-suite leaders, it's such an intense environment. You're focused on driving performance. Most leaders, I think, are genuinely good people who believe they're setting the right tone. They're not really thinking that it's something that has to be top of mind all the time. And in very uncertain economic times and with lots of performance pressures, it's very easy to forget about that. But the reality is that most leaders are not reinforcing core values. They're not talking overtly about their commitment to integrity nearly enough. And when employees don't hear it, they actually believe that it doesn't matter. It's not that they think, oh, it's just not important. They actually believe that senior leaders are either they don't care or they're altogether unethical. So the stakes are pretty high from a CEO perspective. I also think that for boards, I've certainly been in lots of boardrooms doing either the annual ethics training or trying to talk with board members about what should we be asking about ethics and compliance, and truly monitoring the culture, having a real sense of how aware are we of what our key risks are and how confident are we that our employees are going to raise concerns are the two biggest things you have to worry about, more so than anything else.
And you're going exactly where I wanted to go. If I was going to take this up to the boardroom, there's often this push-pull situation, right? So if someone who's new to the boardroom, there's a big change from being in the C-suite, because suddenly you get up in the boardroom, you need to be noses in, fingers out. You're used to managing and making things happen. That's the CEO and the C-suite's role. That's the executive team. That's what they do. Help us understand what the board should do. So you've given a couple examples there, right? So you want to be monitoring key risks. I imagine for someone who's aspiring or a fairly new board member, it must be really hard to adapt to that. What are the best practices that you would suggest maybe on the next level down that the board should focus on?
Well, certainly, I think it's become common practice when directors are getting ready for the meeting assuming there's an ethics and compliance function in place, to get things like hotline statistics and substantiation rates and how long is it taking us to close investigations. And those are some of the metrics that I think the ethics and compliance industry has adopted as the things we provide to the board because we're not really sure what else to give them. And by the same token, directors read them and think, is it good or is it bad that we have a certain number of calls to the helpline? And it's hard to know. But I think for a director, especially a new one coming into a boardroom, there are a couple of important questions to ask. One is, do we actually have an ethics and compliance program in place? And if so, does the chief ethics and compliance officer have a direct reporting relationship in some way to the board? So do they regularly meet with the audit committee alone without anybody else from management in the room so that the board can have a candid conversation? Who does the hiring and the firing of that individual? Does the board have final say in whether or not that person remains employed? And some of those kinds of things are the questions you ask just to be sure, do we have a channel, a way for people in senior leadership to tell us the honest truth without ramifications for their own jobs? But some other things that I think are helpful for directors to try to get their hands on in terms of information, it's really becoming common practice for organizations to do regular culture assessments where they're fielding surveys of employees or they're conducting focus groups or both. And if they're doing it on their own, every now and then they're bringing in a third party that provides their own independent assessment. Employees are remarkably candid when you ask them about their perceptions of the culture, but you have to actually ask them. And that information should be going to the board so that the board has a sense of how much of a compliance risk do we have within this organization. There are also lots of benchmarks available now to give a sense of what are the emerging risks for noncompliance, how do our levels of observed misconduct or reported wrongdoing compare to peer organizations in our industry. Those are some of the things that I think really will help a board member become much more informed. There's also, I know I'm talking about touting my own organization's work, but we have recently developed, based on the input of a Blue Ribbon panel and about 300 different corporations, we've developed a framework for what we consider to be a high-quality ethics and compliance program. And there's an implementation tool that boards and management can use to assess how are we doing in the design of our program and how do we compare to others, not only with regard to major regulations and enforcement standards, but compared to what is considered to truly be best practice in ethics and compliance. And I use that as just one example that there are a lot of places to go and get good benchmarks nowadays. Board members shouldn't necessarily be the ones having to ask for that. But if they're not seeing benchmarks and, more importantly, they're not seeing culture information, they should be asking for that.
And it's wonderful to have that as a tool, because I imagine as a board member, it must be so hard. Just as you talked before, you look at the statistics and you go, is this good or is this bad? If you had, for example, no one who reported since the last report, you could sit there and go, well, maybe that's great. Maybe we are doing well, or maybe people don't feel empowered to come forward. They don't feel safe. And in some ways, it's hard to know based just on those statistics. So it's great that you've got a wider array of tools. And when I step back and I just shake my head at all the stuff we've seen going on from, Uber was a disaster. What's the scandals at CBS and all the others going through. How much of that do you think was the board, without anyone specifically, but sort of in general what we're seeing, how much of that do you think is management falling down versus board responsibility falling down?
Well, certainly the board has an obligation as the governing body to be confident that management is tending to the organization, setting a high standard, creating an environment where those kinds of problems could be detected, or if they were known about, to have been dealt with. In some of those instances, certainly there were situations where there were ongoing problems. Management doesn't always necessarily resolve it early on, and then there becomes an accountability by the board to be sure, are we actually responding to and holding people accountable across all levels of the organization? So some of it is the board. I do think, though, realistically, especially the larger the organization and the more complex the industry, there's only so much you can expect that the board is really going to know about what's going on a day-to-day basis. But that said, there should be at least a faction of the board that is periodically asking management to pull a couple of cases that have come to management's attention and doing sort of a review of its own to see, are we satisfied with the way these cases are being handled? Are we consistently investigating in an objective manner? Are we holding people accountable at all levels across the organization consistently? Are we confident that we're seeing enough information to give us a sense that management really does know what's happening across all of our operations? So on some level, the board, I personally don't believe that for a lot of these scandals, unless the CEO was personally involved, it's not that management generally sets out to actually create a scandal or to break the law or do something wrong. And no one wants a scandal, but they're just not doing enough to actually prevent it. And so in that sense, there is some responsibility on both parts.
And I know that you've got a book coming out next year addressing exactly this. And perhaps it was the working title you shared with me about why scandals happen and how organizations can prevent them. It sounds so topical.
It's a topic that is near and dear to my heart, in part because my organization is a membership organization for ethics and compliance practitioners, but we also because we do research where we're looking to see what are the emerging issues before companies. We also work with individual organizations to help them just try to make sure that they have in place all the systems they need. And unfortunately, more often than not, it's a company that's been through a problem and they've figured it out the hard way that they really need to take a hard look at what they're doing. And all of that over the years has just made me think about, why do these problems happen, and what are the things that organizations can try to do to prevent them? Because I do think most of the time we learn in the aftermath that, and sometimes it's down the road, but there were signs, there were signals, there were people who knew, there were, reports through a hotline or coming up through management, and they just got ignored, or people were retaliated against. And the whole thing could have been avoided.
It's interesting because we can always look back with hindsight and say 2020, but it's being smart about it as we go forward and taking action. And I imagine for a board member, if you are in that situation, you've never seen it before, it's so hard to figure out, well, how do I find someone who's been there and done it before? Because usually people don't want to put their hand up and say, oh, I was in the middle of a scandal when we addressed it because it was so painful. You usually want to hide that behind the scenes. Do you have advice for how people can go about finding other people who've been through those bad situations and connecting? Maybe those are sort of your sorts of events where people get to share those case studies in a sort of a Chatham House Rules type situation?
Sure. Well, so that does happen on some level. I do know, especially within the ethics and compliance community, if we hear of a company that's going through a challenging time, peer organizations or others that have been through similar circumstances will reach out to try to offer guidance and support, tell them what not to do, things to avoid. I think the same is probably true for board members. Certainly, I do think one of the things that organizations will very quickly do in the process when the scandalization is sort of unfolding, so much of what makes a scandal is how the situation gets covered in the press.
Right.
I mean, truly, a scandal becomes a scandal when the media calls it that. But boards will often quickly make a decision that they need to hire a third-party consultant to come in and do an independent investigation. And one of the common mistakes they'll make is to pledge right away, we're going to make the full report public, we're open kimono, and very often the report comes out and they're caught flat-footed. And so I know that in certain situations, if a company is starting to have real problems in the media, peer directors will call them and give them guidance about what I would have done differently if I had been in that situation. Again, nothing wrong with, and the spirit is right, that you do an investigation, you release the results, you speak to how you're going to change, but you also want to give yourself a little bit of room to digest what's going on and come up with the right plan and be able to speak responsibly about what actually happened, what was the root cause, and what are you going to do about it. So there are those kinds of mechanisms in place informally. But certainly, I mean, communities like membership communities of compliance officers, I presume organizations that directors are a part of also may have similar networks in place.
That makes sense. And Pat, when I sort of reflect back on what's happening and what's going on, there's clearly a need for organizations like yourself to be sharing those best practice, that guidance and advice. And I would just be curious to know from your own perspective. So you're a board member, for example. We could talk about the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. I imagine when you walked in on your first day and your first official role there, you probably had some of this stuff brimming in your background, probably not the same level of what we talked about. But how does someone like you, with your focus and the way that you bring that special skill set, come to an organization and say, I don't know if we've ever thought about things this way. How about we take a look down here? How did you begin your process as a board member there?
That's a great question. And I do think for me, one of the biggest, it's been very helpful to be a board member because the way our organization is structured, I report to two boards as the CEO. So it's really helpful to have a sense of what do I need to talk to my board about now that I'm a director on the other side. Certainly when you're brand new walking into the boardroom, I mean, it's not unlike a workplace culture. You have to learn, okay, I know who the chair is, but who's really informally in charge here, and how do we really do things, and what's acceptable for me to ask, and what's not acceptable for me to ask. And that's actually, it's a culture unto itself. So there's always a little bit of a learning curve, but I think, too, as I've been a director, I've certainly focused my attention first on, do we have the basics in place so that I'm confident that our financials are correct, that things that are disciplinary actions that we're taking against staff, I'm confident that they're accurate and being investigated thoroughly and we're handling them well. But certainly, too, I have, over time, gotten a whole lot more courageous, too, in making suggestions about how do we safeguard the organization from unwanted scrutiny or going too far off the rails. It's not an easy task. One thing that I do think is becoming a trend that I applaud is that boards are starting to think about recruiting as directors people who have been in the ethics and compliance industry. And there certainly is a lot of interest by E&C professionals in getting board seats because they have spent so much time reporting to boards and they know so much about organizational culture. They have a lot to add in helping the board just ask the right questions of management. So that, too, is another thing that's worth really trying to pursue if a company has board seats available. And the last thing I would say is that I think it's very helpful. Boards generally, especially if they're publicly traded, they're required to do some kind of ethics training once a year. I think some of the companies that have gotten much more sophisticated in thinking about it actually allow extra time for talking with the ethics and compliance team from management or dedicating more time on the board agenda to not just talking about the ethics and compliance program in the organization, but the culture overall. How are we doing in managing our risks? and as an entirely new dimension, the ethics issues that directors face. Because we are, unfortunately, now living in an age where a single director can make an offhanded comment and throw the company into a scandal all by themselves. So that's a whole new level of ethics and compliance that boards need to tend to.
And it is a very different world. And I love the way you're talking about it there, is that boards are beginning to think about having this type of skill set onto the board. So diversity is a huge thing on the board. And to me, that's not just gender. It's not just nationality. It's global perspective, socioeconomic background, skill set, right? So you're seeing more technology like cyber people getting elevated, certain media, marketing, social media type experts. Compliance ethics, I absolutely agree, is very important. But my friend Will Messenger, who is an ethicist and teaches it in my master's program here, talks about how about 10 years ago when he was looking to get his first board seat, people didn't know what box to put him in when his candidacy came forward. They couldn't wrap their head around it. And the board seat he ended up eventually landing, they said, well, you'll run like the HR nominating governance type stuff. I guess that's a fit for you. So the world has changed a lot now that people are recognizing more of like, we're not just going to fit them in. There's a specific place that we want that skill set in.
I think that's true. And I think one of the things that we can attribute to Sarbanes-Oxley is that the audit committee somehow has inherited all responsibility for oversight of ethics and compliance. And I'm not sure that that is the best place anymore. I mean, better there than nowhere. Right. But when it comes to things like culture and holding leadership accountable and performance goals for the C-suite management team or for the CEO from the board's perspective, that goes well beyond the scope of the audit committee, and that's where having some expertise from ethics and compliance is valuable as a director. But if companies have limited numbers of seats, I don't see why they also couldn't have an advisor from ethics and compliance, or people that are a part of the audit committee who are not official voting board members but are ex officio or something like that, because you really need to have that voice in the room of someone who knows what kinds of things to guide the board to ask, or is looking out for the ethics or compliance dimension of everyday business decisions. More and more, as companies are global in their operations and becoming more aggressive in mergers and acquisitions and all kinds of business transitions, every one of those decisions comes with a pretty healthy measure of compliance risk. And the enforcement community is getting a lot more sophisticated in how they think about whether a company has done its due diligence and done a good job in building a good ethics and compliance program. So to just dismiss that and say we have a function on a chart and we see numbers in every board meeting is really not doing enough. It's really become much more of a real risk to an organization.
I think that's very well said. And Pat, we could just be going on and on about this. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. I'm sure many in our audience will want to follow up to know more. Perhaps have now realized how much more they need to know. What would be the best way for people to be in touch and perhaps be getting some of ECI's great knowledge?
Well, our website is very simple to remember. It's www.ethics.org. And there you can find out, we have most of our research studies we make available to the public for free. And certainly if directors are interested in learning more about some of the training programs that we do for boards, or how they can talk with us about some of the other work that we do, I'd certainly be happy to have them reach out. My email address is pat@ethics.org. So I'd welcome anybody who has questions or comments.
Well, Pat, we were just delighted to have you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of our audience to be more boardroom bound.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Pat Harned. This is the time when all board directors need to be thinking about ethics and compliance. We need to be aware of what's going on. The world is changing. The expectations are changing. As Pat explained in the show, it just takes one offhand remark from a director or an employee for the media to get a hold of something and it's a scandal, and suddenly we're all engulfed in a very intense time. This is something that we can get in front of in many cases, but also we got thoughts today about how to respond in those sorts of crises. As a board member, the expectations are raised. The opportunity is there for us to add value, both on a daily basis, getting ready for a crisis and in the middle of a crisis. So much helpful information for all of us today. Now remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu where you can get links to the resources that we talked about today. And please also recognize that the Boardroom Bound team and I at the end of the day are just so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.